Alright everybody, my name is Pandatar, and welcome to this video, where I'm going to be going over and giving my opinions on all of the potential new toys for Greasefang that we are getting in Aetherdrift. So I'm going to kind of go over things in a weird sequence, but basically we're going to start with all the stuff that's playable in just every archetype of Greasefang, so the stuff that's colorless, white, and black. And then we're going to go into the different archetypes by themselves. Coming up on the slides, I'm going to have a couple different cards. Anything that has an honorable mention in front of it is basically something I think that could be impactful or useful to the archetype down the line, but maybe isn't so impactful right now. And we'll get into a couple examples of that coming up. But let's just go ahead and get into it. And we're going to start off with the big one here. This is probably the card that everybody most pinned is going to be for Greasefang, and for rightful reason. So this is Valor's flagship. If you haven't seen it already, it's on screen. If you can't see it, it's 4 triple white for a legendary artifact vehicle that is a 7/7 with flying, first strike, lifelink, crew 3, and then it has cycling X for 2 and a white. And when you cycle this card, you create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens with this token's saddles, mounts, and cruise vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So the big draw, and the reason why everyone's kind of pinned this card for Greasefang, is not only is it a kind of a big dumb idiot that hits in the air and is evasive, in a similar vein to Parhelion, but it does put itself into the graveyard with its cycling ability. So this is particularly useful for games where maybe your opponent can't remove your Greasefang, and it's able to stick on the board after the first hit, and then you're able to just pay 3 or 4 mana, depending on whether you want the pilot token or not, to put itself back in the graveyard for Greasefang to immediately reanimate it again. So I think that this card is probably going to make its way into every Greasefang archetype. Whether it's one copy or whether it's multiple copies, I think is yet to be seen. I do think that this card does end up being a little bit worse than Parhelion, just because it represents less damage immediately, and then it also doesn't set up for a kill the next turn either. However, it can't be overstated the lifelink, allowing you to swing the life total by 14 points. Potentially digging you out of situations where maybe you are not doing so well, and that buys you an extra turn or two to close out the game. But going down the different archetypes and how I think this is going to fit, in Abzan, I think it's less impactful here, mostly due to the present consistency that we have in order to rebuy into the Parhelion combo, but also not necessarily like needing to if we do the Parhelion thing, and that kind of goes for all 3 of them, but more specifically, Abzan is definitely the most turbo-oriented variant of Greasefang, and so a lot of your plays are going to revolve around hitting the Parhelion combo, and so this doesn't really present a better option, it's just a more flexible option. But also on turn 4, if you aren't doing the Parhelion thing, you are kind of wanting to probably just curve out into Essica's Chariot. Chariot is a very, very good card, and it does allow you to have some onboard presence that maybe is a little bit better than just putting this into the bin again and making a 1/1. For Esper, I think this is probably the best fit for this card. Esper generally is a lot more suited to playing protracted games where the life swing is a lot more noticeable and more valuable. It does also lend itself to playing to control game plan, and that you don't have to create any dudes with it. So if you're put into a position where maybe you need to wipe the board the next turn, then Parhelion feels kind of bad because you're kind of wiping your kill off the board, or not your kill, but you're potentially wiping your dudes off the board and maybe not finishing the job. Whereas this is a little bit more clean cut. You can reanimate it, hit with it, and then you can wipe the board after if your Greasefang needs to block or gets removed, and you not really feel bad about it. And then Mardu, kind of like Abzan, a little less impactful because you're really more incentivized to play your powerful 3-drops like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and then possibly Unholy Annex. But I do think, again, kind of already broached the options. It does swing the life total a lot. It can be powerful in concert with Shieldred if you're still playing that. Does allow you to hit them for 7, and then you get an extra 2 damage. But yeah, I think that's about it. Like I said, I think in almost all the archetypes is probably going to end up being at least a 1 of, maybe more. Personally, I plan to probably cut one of my Parhelions for one of these, just because it does have some more flexibility and can dig you out of games where you're already behind by the time you manage to get the Greasefang thing going. But moving on to the next card, we have Tune-Up. So Tune-Up is kind of a retrain of other similar cards that we've seen in the past, like Refurbish. It's 4 mana sorcery for 3 and a white. It says return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If it's a vehicle, it becomes an artifact creature. Kind of good, just generically. Where we haven't really seen these cards in the past is being able to reanimate vehicles, as well as just generic artifacts. But what this really does for us is it allows us to start opening up lines where maybe we can reanimate the Parhelion straight up instead of having to use Greasefang to do that for us. Notably, it doesn't give the Parhelion haste, but it does allow us to put it on the board where maybe your opponent will struggle to remove it. So going down the different archetypes, Abzan I think is unlikely to make it fit into the deck, just because Abzan with cards like Grizzly Salvage and Cash Grab are kind of just mills indiscriminately, and instants and sorceries are the hardest type for us to buy back. All of our enablers that don't discard cards, that just mill, don't buy back instants and sorceries, so it kind of makes it difficult. Some decks, like mine, have been playing a single copy of Lively Dirge as a kind of just a one-of off-target thing that allows you to reanimate Greasefang and maybe a little bit extra, or tutor a Parhelion in the bin, something like that. So maybe this could replace that, and just kind of, if you hit it, great. If you don't, it is what it is. But we'll see. Esper, though, I think is tied with Mardu for the best fit for this. Control variants of Esper are generally going to want to play a slower game plan, where this is really going to shine, allowing you to be less reliant on Greasefang itself, and just be able to put the Parhelion into play without having to worry about it. Notably, if control variants are playing stuff like Shieldred, then Shieldred can crew Parhelion as well, while still maintaining its passive effect, basically, and let you get in there. So I think this is probably where Tune-Up is going to best fit. And then Mardu, kind of the same thing. I think that maybe it's a little bit less good in Mardu than it will be in Esper, just because of the way that Mardu generally wants to play. You definitely want to be a little bit more creature focused and board focused than, and your control options maybe aren't as good. But it definitely could see. And the main reason that Esper and Mardu are going to be good fits for Tune-Up is just because they get to discard cards. They don't have to worry about milling it over or anything like that. They get to choose whether they want it in their hand or not, so it makes it a lot more effective. But overall, I do think that this is going to see play in definitely probably the Esper control variant, just because it does give you a lot of flexibility. But moving on to our last card in white, we have our first honorable mention, Salvation Engine. So this is a 4 and a white for a vehicle that says other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever it attacks, return up to 1 target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It has crew 6 and it's a 6/10. my opinion on this is that this card is very good. I think that there is a lot of flexibility to be had with this card. I think the biggest glaring issues with it, though, are the crew 6 and not having any kind of evasion whatsoever. Not that not that evasion is necessary when you only have, or when you have 10 toughness. I'm not worried about it getting killed in combat, but more so that you can't guarantee your damage with it, so you can just get chump blocked by a 1/1, you know. But the crew 6 is really the main gutting point. If you are playing something like Rotting Regisaur already, like I do in my list, this card does get a lot better because you are able to crew it without having to worry. However, that does mean that like your non-summoning sick Regisaur has to crew instead of your summoning sick Greasefang. And whether that's good enough to get you what you want to do is dubious at best, I think. So it's still kind of an uphill battle, but I do think it is an interesting option in the future, and it does offer us something if we get a solid low cost 6 power creature or greater, 6 power or greater creature, or if we just find that there are more artifacts that we want to do, since this can reanimate any artifact, not just vehicles. So if we find that maybe we have a good 6 or higher power creature and Portal to Phyrexia is really something we're wanting to have, then this can kind of do both, where if we have Portal to Phyrexia in the bin, we can reanimate this with Greasefang, crew it, attack with it, put the portal into play, and then we're really kind of rolling. But I think that's yet to be seen, and, you know, we have a lot to go before we get there. Moving on to black cards. I think that this card is probably going to be my pick for most relevant card for Greasefang decks in the set. This is Crypt Caller Chariot. It is a 3 and a black vehicle with Menace. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you create that many tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. It has crew 2, and it is a 5/5. And this seems maybe not quite as good when you read it through the first time, but when you think about how many discard outlets that Esper and Mardu have to play in order to facilitate the functioning of the deck, and then when you think about how they don't already get to play Eska's Chariot, I think you really start to see that this is going to probably try and fill that role for those decks. Whether Mardu or not wants to play, or whether Mardu wants to play it or not, maybe yet to be seen, because they kind of have better cards in Fable the Mirror Breaker that they maybe want to play. But it does go heavily synergistic with Fable the Mirror Breaker, so maybe this is something that just ends up where I think it's going to be, and I think this is going to be at least 3 copies in those decks, because it does just provide you incredible board presence for doing something that you were already planning to do. But going down the list, Abzan, it relies almost exclusively on milling, which heavily diminishes the effectiveness. Obviously, you still have cards like Regisaur and Liliana of the Veil that can help contribute to this, but it is competing with Eska's Chariot for the same slot, so I think that this card's probably not going to make it in Abzan. However, in Esper, it is tied with Mardu for the best fit for the card. Variants of Esper not wanting to play control strategies have been seriously lacking because they don't have an Eska's Chariot style vehicle, and so they've been a little bit more reliant on stuff like Rafine, Scheming Seer, and creatures that, you know, aren't quite as powerful as what this represents. So that definitely gives it a boost. And then Mardu, same place as Esper, highly synergistic with your already present discard synergies. And it does go pretty crazy with Fable the Mirror Breaker, though notably it doesn't curve with Fable the Mirror Breaker. Since Fable's second chapter resolves on your at the beginning of your main phase after your draw step, you don't get the chance to cast this before you resolve the ability. Now, that being said, I don't think that's going to kill this card. This card is incredibly powerful. It has evasion. It's well statted. It can crew for 2, which is also incredibly important because that means it only takes 1 of your zombies to crew, unlike Eska's Chariot, where it does take both of your cats to crew. But I think this card is going to be great. And I don't really think there's any sugarcoating it. So, like I said, this is my pick for probably the most impactful card in the set. Moving on, though, we have our first honorable mention in black, which is probably a card that most people haven't seen, maybe. I definitely didn't know it existed until I was going through and making the slideshow. But this is Chitin Gravestalker. It's 5 and a black for a 5/4. It costs 1 less to cast for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard. And then it has cycling too. So this is very comparable to Gurmag Angler, but you don't have to exile the stuff out of your own bin to cast it. Now, that being said, I don't think a 1 mana 5/4 is necessarily the most impactful thing. It does kind of, there is kind of something that already exists called Souls of the Lost from Lost Cavern's Ixalan that is kind of competing for the same thing. Souls of the Lost being 2 mana instead of 1, and then needing you to discard a card or sacrifice a creature, which isn't really a downside, but it does also scale bigger. Its power is equal. Its power is equal to the number of permanents in your graveyard, and then its toughness is equal to 1 plus that amount. So again, I don't think this will be the most impactful thing. It does dodge more than a few of the common removal spells. It dodges any of the 3 damage red removal spells. It doesn't get got by Rending Volley, anything like that might be targeting our Greasefang specifically. And it also dodges Fatal Push, so that's not stuff that we should write off, but I don't think is going to be impactful right this second. It does best fit in Abzan, again, because you're milling stuff, so you're definitely a lot more likely to cast this for 1 mana, but it is an option that we have should we want it. Next up is going to be Demonic Junker as an honorable mention. This is a 6 and a black for a vehicle with affinity for artifacts, and when this vehicle enters, for each player, destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you control this was destroyed this way, put 2 1/1 counters on this vehicle, and then it has crew 2. I think on the surface, this looked a lot better than maybe it is. It's competing for the same spot as Sky Sovereign, and Sky Sovereign can very often get you 2 for 1s, whereas this will just always only get you 1. And then also, kind of across all the variants of Greasefang, you don't really put enough creatures on the board to where blowing your own creature up is really where you want to be to make this a bigger beater. It does have some synergy with being able to reanimate with Greasefang, and that you could just get to blow up a creature immediately when it enters. However, I just don't think that that's necessarily the best. Like I said, I do think Sky Sovereign is a lot better with Greasefang. Obviously, it's a lot worse to cast. However, it's 5 mana versus 7 mana, maybe a little bit less depending on how many artifacts you have, which most of our Greasefang archetypes can't really satisfy the affinity clause very well. So maybe this is an option in the future. I'm just mentioning it because it is just straight up a murder. But I think there will need to be some more interesting options, at least for Esper and Mardu, or less interesting options for Esper and Mardu before we play this. And as you'll see later on, Abzan gets something that's actually just straight up better than this anyway. So moving on again to our last black card, we have Hellish Sideswipe, which is a single black sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, and destroy target creature or vehicle. If the sacrifice permanent was a vehicle, draw a card. So kind of what I'm saying in the text, I wouldn't normally include a sorcery speed removal spell, because all 3 really kind of hinge on that instant speed removal to be better and help us satisfy what we're trying to do with Greasefang. However, being a 1 mana removal spell means that this is something we can do with Greasefang on turn 4, where we can reanimate with Greasefang, hit with whatever vehicle, and then we can immediately sacrifice it to remove another creature off the board. And if we sacrifice the vehicle that we brought back with Greasefang, not only do we put it back in the bin for Greasefang to reanimate the next turn, but we do also draw a card, which is a lot of value potentially for us. I don't see it being played at the current moment, just because it's I think it's a little bit too much to ask, maybe. But I think potentially down the line, if we're looking at a lot of decks where they don't have a whole lot of interaction, but we need to interact with their stuff, I think that this could definitely be an option. And it is definitely powerful. But we'll see how it fits in later down the line. Like I said, I don't think right now it's probably the best option. And then we've got an honorable mention, our only colorless card. Now, this card is, first of all, it's Monument to Endurance. It's a 3-mana artifact. Whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. You can draw a card, create a treasure token, or each opponent loses 3 life. So while this card isn't really, again, going to fit in Abzan, just because you don't have a lot of discard outlets inherently, it is definitely an option for Esper and Mardu. It allows us to take advantage of something that we already want to be doing, which is fairly powerful. That being said, especially in Esper, where you have something like Faithful Mending that allows you to, draw 2, discard 2, and then you can replace itself by drawing an extra card when you discard. Makes Faithful Mending card neutral instead of card negative. But that being said, I think spending a turn off on turn 3 to cast this may not necessarily be good enough. At the current moment, maybe nor in the future. I think there could be a spot for this in control variants of Esper, but I don't know if they're going to want to play it right off the rip, just because it's slow and it's maybe not helpful for where the meta is at currently, because it doesn't kind of outvalue what Rakdos mid-range has got going on right now, nor does it stop them in any particular way. But this card is definitely an option for those later down the line, and I would really like to maybe see an Esper control variant pick it up as a one-of or something, just because it is a lot of value potentially. But moving on, we're going to move into our Abzan specific options. So this is going to be stuff that is either mono green or includes green. Basically isn't something that you're going to want to splash for in Esper or Mardu. First up, we have Broodheart Engine. Broodheart Engine is a black and a green for an artifact that says at the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. And then you can pay 2 black-green, tap, and sacrifice it to return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can only activate that ability as a sorcery. This card is probably going to cause a lot of discussion around it, I guess is the best way I can put it. So where a lot of people are going to see this is potentially replacing one of your primary enablers, like Grizzly Salvage or Cash Grab. But where I think it actually probably makes more sense is replacing one of your reanimation spells. So currently, Abzan's most effective reanimation spells can't stay away, because it is only 2 mana to reanimate a 3-drop or less. But it does have flashback, so if you mill it over, you still get use out of it. But I think that this being an option you can play on turn 2 to help continue to enable, allowing you to surveil off the top of your library to maybe put that vehicle in the bin for your Greasefang, while also being able to reanimate stuff is mightily impressive. It is also retrievable off of Cash Grab, so that's something to be aware of as well, is that this is something you can grab off Cash Grab if you don't want to grab a land or maybe a Greasefang or something like that. And it does contribute to reanimating your stuff. Now, while Can't Stay Away does cost 2 mana on the front side and then 5 mana on the flashback, this does cost 6 to do it all in the same turn, including having double black, double green. But I think that maybe this is something you're going to want to run out earlier, and I think that this probably will be impactful. I will say that most Abzan variants are probably going to want to play this. Unfortunately, my version of Abzan, where I play a lot more 3-drops, will probably be more interested in staying on Can't Stay Away because there are other things we can reanimate. However, I'm definitely probably going to give this a try in that slot. Being able to reanimate the vehicles is big game, especially with some of the stuff we're going to show in a minute. So I don't discount that at all. And maybe it's just fine. Maybe paying 4 mana is just fine, even to reanimate your Regisaur or your Glissa Sunslayer or something like that. If I go back to those cards. But I think this definitely deserves a spot in Abzan, or at the very least, heavy consideration for you if you're already playing reanimation spells. Moving on, we have the first of 2 Golgari vehicles brought to us this set. This is Debris Beetle. It is 2 black-green for a vehicle with Trample, and when this vehicle enters, each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. Crew 2, and a 6/6. So, for those of you who are familiar with Siege Rhino, this is a effectively power-crept version of Siege Rhino. And this is just a really, really good base board option for Abzan. It's both a solid reanimation target with good stats, good evasive keyword, low crew cost, but it's also extremely castable as well. Now, it does fight for the same slot, maybe, as Esika's Chariot. And I think Esika's Chariot is generally going to be better than this on average. I think this is certainly not a bad option. I think where this card shines is really where you're going to be able to kind of do the Esika's Chariot's similar style of play, where you reanimate this on 3, offset the life total by 6, and then cast it on 4, and then offset it by another 6, as well as getting your 6/6 trample in on turn 3 with Greasefang. So I think this is a fantastic option, and I am definitely looking to play this. I would even go so far to say as running a split of this and Esika's Chariot could definitely be something great for your flexibility play. Or even if we're just in a meta where Burn is the best deck in the format, whether that be with flyers or something that your cats can't block, then maybe this takes over for that, because it does allow you to swing the life total immediately instead of having to put some blockers on board. But moving on to our second Golgari vehicle, this is Thundering Broodwagon. Its casting cost is 2 double black, double green for a vehicle with Menace and Reach. When this vehicle enters, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. It has Crew 3 and Cycling 2, and it's a 6/5. I don't think it is a bit obtuse to say that this card has a lot going on for an uncommon. There is a lot going on. It currently, with the text of its ability allowing you to destroy any non-land permanent, is going to be competing with Sky Sovereign very heavily. Sky Sovereign, again, like I said with Demonic Junker earlier, does often represent a 2-for-1, being able to nug 2 creatures with its ETB and attack triggers. However, this thing lets you blow up your opponent's Fable the Mirror Breaker before they get any value off of it. Also, it puts itself into the graveyard on turn 2, which is incredibly relevant. I think that this card is probably going to be better than Sky Sovereign, which I think is going to be a really controversial take, but I think that we have a lot of issues with non-land permanents that are specifically not creatures that we need to deal with, and this does that. Now, the one minus on this card is that it is harder to cast than Sky Sovereign. And it's not even a little bit harder, it is far harder to cast. Double black and double green could definitely be a stretch. And I think that's something to take into account for it. However, I think with as few times as we're actually hard casting any of our vehicles in Abzan that aren't 4 mana, I think that maybe that doesn't matter so much. Being able to put itself into the graveyard on turn 2 is very, very big. And I think that its evasion is not quite as good as flying, but menace is definitely fine. And then it's also a decent blocker too, because it does also block stuff with flying, and its crew cost is relatively low. So I think that this card is going to fully compete with Sky Sovereign, and I would expect it to either come down to a split or probably even more in favor of Thundering Broodwagon. But only time will tell, and we'll see how things kind of change. And they'll definitely be interchangeable moving forward. For our first honorable mention, we've got Earth Rumbler, which is a 4 and a green for a vehicle with Vigilance and Trample. And you can exile an artifact or creature card from your graveyard, and this vehicle becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. It's got Crew 3, and it is a 7/6. This card is punchy. This is easily the most aggressive option we have access to in terms of vehicles. It has an easy casting cost, needing only a singular green pip. It's got Vigilance, Trample, and it's pretty beefy, so it can both attack and block. It can turn itself into a creature, as well as it has a reasonable crew cost. So this is really kind of a perfect storm of stuff. I just don't think it quite fits in where we're wanting to be right now. Abzan, where its flexibility lies in its vehicles, is allowing it to play a protracted game if it needs to, with Eska's Chariot and Sky Sovereign, and being able to play a mid-range plan. And Earth Rumbler just doesn't quite do that. It's more of a close the game quickly kind of card. So if we need that, this is definitely a good option. I mean, this is wild. But it's not quite so good with the main Greasefang plan. It's just generically good as a beat stick that maybe we can cast into and then continue beating with it on every turn without having to sacrifice a blocker for it. Then we have our next honorable mention, which is Dredger's Insight. Dredger's Insight is a 1 and a green for an enchantment. It says whenever an artifact, one or more artifact and or creatures cards leave your graveyard, you gain 1 life. And then when it enters, you mill 4 cards, and you can put an artifact, creature, or land from among the milled cards into your hand. So at base, this seems like a great card. At the very bare minimum, this is a 2 mana that lets you mill 4, get back one of your options, and also gain you a life. But I think that maybe what needs to be said is that sorcery speed isn't exactly where we want to be. There is a lot of upside to Cash Grab and Grizzly Salvage being at instant speed, in that you don't have to commit to it that turn, and you don't have to give your opponent access. If they were to have a 2 mana something that ETBs and exiles a card from a graveyard, you don't give them access to that if you're able to play at instant speed. And I don't think the life gain is quite where we want it to be at either. Gaining a trivial amount of life every turn could be interesting if you're able to string Cash Grabs and Greasefangs together and stuff like that, but I think it's kind of negligible and doesn't make up for the lack of instant speed. If we do get some better delve spells in the upcoming Tarkir set, this could definitely shoot up in usefulness, just if we're constantly delving stuff away. But I think that this is probably a worse option than what we already have. I'm just going to mention it because it is something to keep in the back of our minds in case we do decide that we want to play at sorcery speed. Maybe if we end up in a meta, super combo heavy meta, where it doesn't really particularly matter because no one's going to be removing our stuff anyway, the life gain could be relevant. But yeah, so moving on into the Esper specific options. Unfortunately, for both Esper and Mardu, we don't have quite as many cards that I think are going to make splashes or could make splashes right off the rip. But this is the one I picked for Esper, which is Guidelight Pathmaker. Guidelight Pathmaker is 4 white-blue for a vehicle with Vigilance. And when this vehicle enters, you may search your library for an artifact card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it into your hand, then shuffle. It has crew 2, and it is a 6/5. So while it doesn't look particularly powerful right off the rip, its ability to tutor any artifact really can't be overlooked. I haven't exactly spent the time to scour the Pioneer card base to find if there's anything particularly broken to do with this right this second. But even if it doesn't exist, it can and probably will exist. From this set specifically, there is a 2 mana artifact dude. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it's 1 in a blue, and it can blow itself up for a single blue to soft counter an instant sorcery, or unless they pay 3. So there could be something there already where you kind of set yourself up for a potential Greasefang into Guidelight Pathmaker, leaving up a blue mana to hold open protection. But just its generic splash ability to grab any artifact card and put it straight into play if it's 2 or less, I think is definitely going to make it an option moving forward, even if it isn't an option right this second. That being said, it does have similar stats to Sky Sovereign. It is a 6/5. It does have Vigilance. So even if you were to hard cast this for 6 mana, which I probably won't think you're going to want to do, it does both attack and block very well as long as you have creatures to crew it. But there is so much potential flexibility in this card that I think it would be bad not to bring it up as a good option for Esper. Yeah, so moving on to the next one. This one's probably going to get a lot of talk. Just in me bringing it up at the very least. This is Mu Yanling Windrider. So Mu Yanling Windrider is 2 blue for a 2/4. It says when this creature enters, create a 3/2 colorless vehicle artifact token with crew 1. And then vehicles you control have flying. And whenever 1 or more creatures you control with flying deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. I don't think, this is why this is an honorable mention, I don't think this card slots into Esper at the current moment. But I don't preclude it from slotting into an Esper variant at all. I think that where we're at right now with Greasefang, we're really wanting to be a combo-oriented deck, as opposed to using Greasefang as a value engine. But if we were to get to that point where we want to use Greasefang as a value engine instead of a combo piece, then Mu Yanling definitely can be the backbone to something like that in Esper. She lets your cheap vehicles, including the one she creates when she enters, net you card advantage, which is big. And there's just a lot going on there by giving your other vehicles flying. So even if you have something, some undercosted vehicles that are a little bit mopey because they don't have an evasive keyword, now they do. Something off the top of my head, like Consulate Dreadnought or something like that. If you were ever to play an Esper shell with Consulate Dreadnought and like Mobilizer Mech, then crewing the mech allows you to crew the Dreadnought, and then you can hit for 10 in the air and draw a card off of it as well. So definitely not something that's going to fit in right now, but there could be an archetype or a variant of Esper that's made specifically around this card. So I just figured I'd bring it up because I do think it is powerful, just maybe doesn't have a home right this second. And then moving on to our Mardu-specific options. Unfortunately for Mardu, I don't have any cards that I think are actually gunners for the main deck. I think that both of these options I'm about to bring up are strong in and of themselves, but I think that they do have downsides that are real and relevant and maybe cause them to not want to be as powerful as something like Cryptcaller Chariot. So the first one is our first honorable mention. It's Clamorous Ironclad. This is a 3 and a red for a vehicle with Menace, Crew 3, Cycling for a red, and it is a 6/3. So it's definitely a really good punchy option for Mardu, though its toughness, being at 3 toughness, could prove problematic. mostly in the realm of talking about removal spells. So this is obviously susceptible to red removal spells that generally base board do 3 damage, or can do 3 damage at the very least, which means that you may not be able to get into the paint with this one as often as you think. But to offset that, it does have a reasonable crew cost, it does have evasion, and it does also put itself into the bin on turn 1, which gives you an option of something to do if you have an untapped land like a Blackcleave Cliffs or something like that, and you don't have a Thoughtseize to cast. So I'm definitely not super optimistic that this is going to make a splash right away, but it is definitely an option that we have in our bank. And then kind of along the same line, we've got our next card, which is Gastal Thrill Roller. It is a 2 and a red vehicle with trample and haste, and when it enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. It has crew 2, and then it has 2 and a red, discard a card, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it, and activate only as a sorcery, and it is a 4/2. So this is definitely a weird card. On its surface, it's overcosted for its low stats, even though it's got trample and haste, and it crews itself when it enters. But the real gold is in that activated ability that you can activate from the graveyard that allows you to discard something else, maybe like a Parhelion, while continuing to apply pressure by reanimating itself and crewing itself. So at no point in time on the first turn when this card enters will you ever have to crew it, which does allow you to get in for 4 with trample immediately. But like I said, that does set up your further turns where maybe you have something stuck in your hand that you need to pitch, and you can do that from your graveyard while still pushing in damage. Same thing with the last one. 2 toughness is kind of bad. Means it dies to a lot of red removal spells without ever getting in the paint. But being able to bring itself back is a little bit more forgiving than the last one, where it doesn't get to bring itself back by itself. So I could definitely see this being an option. Again, I just don't think it slots in right away just because its stats aren't quite big enough to apply that much pressure. But it's definitely something there could be use for in the future. And then getting on to our last bit, we've got cards that I picked out that maybe people will look at and say, man, I really think that fits in Greasefang, but I really just don't think they work quite as well as we want them to. So the first 2 cards, Detention Chariot and Possession Engine, both kind of have the same drawback in that they're really bad to reanimate with Greasefang. Detention Chariot just it basically just exiles something until it leaves, and then Possession Engine, you gain control of it until it leaves. But obviously, if you're reanimating both of these with Greasefang, then they kind of just move something out of the way temporarily, and then they get it back anyway. So not the most impactful things. The notable upside to Detention Chariot is that it does cycle for a singular white. So it can put itself into the bin on turn 1. However, neither of them have an evasive keyword, and I believe their stats are just okay. I think Detention Chariot's like a 6/6, and Possession Engine is like a 5 power or something like that. So not the greatest options. Repurposing Bay. This is a new version of like Oswald Fiddlebender, which allows you to pay 2 and tap and sack I think it's a vehicle to go get an artifact that costs exactly 1 more. So stuff that's been brought up is being able to sacrifice Parhelion to go get Portal to Phyrexia. But I just don't know that this is necessarily where we're going to want to be. It does, unlike the other kind of artifact pod style cards, it does allow you to activate it at instant speed. But I think that, 3 mana to cast it, it's got to sit on the battlefield, and then you've got to pay 2 mana to activate it. I think it's probably a little slow, even if it does allow us to get something as powerful as Portal to Phyrexia. Carrion Cruiser, this is an interesting one. So it ETBs to mill 2, and then you can return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to your hand. I think that really this isn't going to quite fit just because it's kind of doing a poor impression of Overlord of the Baelmerk, where it's 3 mana to cast it. It's only a 3/2. It doesn't have an evasive keyword. You only mill 2 cards. Even if you reanimate it with Greasefang, you're then attacking for 3 damage. It's just kind of mediocre. So I don't really think it fits in anywhere, even though it is castable and it could fit in any of the archetypes. Then we've got Quag Feast, which is probably one of the more interesting cards we have access to. I probably should have put the card text up on the screen, but it is 1 in a black sorcery that's choose target creature, planeswalker, or vehicle, and then you mill 2 cards and destroy the chosen permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. It's fine. It's fine. It could be useful. I don't think it will be. I think sorcery, like I said about the 1 mana removal spell, I think sorcery speed removal is not where we want to be at. And paying 2 mana to do so definitely isn't, even if it does mill 2 cards. The other thing is that, if you haven't stocked your graveyard yet already, then it is only killing something with mana value 2 or less. So you're just paying 2 mana for a fatal push without revolt at that point. But it's an option, I guess. I don't think it's good enough, in my opinion. But we'll wait and see. Moving on, we have The Last Ride, which is basically just a vehicle version of Death's Shadow with an activated ability to pay 2 and a black. I believe it's draw a card and lose 2 life, or pay 2 and a black, 2 life, draw a card. So again, just not really where we were wanting to be. Most of the variants of Greasefang do have to shock themselves a decent bit, so you can get this to the point where it is swinging in for big damage, but I just don't. It doesn't do anything else to accelerate the plan. It's not good to reanimate with Greasefang. It's just not very good for us in particular. Then we've got the red options, Marauding Mako and Road Rage. Road Rage is just a removal spell. It deals X damage, where X is 2 plus the number of mounts and vehicles you control. It's very rare that we ever have more than 1 vehicle in play, so paying, 1 mana to bolt a creature or planeswalker isn't the most effective thing in the world. And then Marauding Mako, honestly, almost made my honorable mentions, but I don't think it's quite good enough. It's just a 1 mana 1/1 that whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put that many 1/1 counters on this creature. So maybe if this was a single blue and you were able to do something like curve this into Faithful Mending and immediately make it a 3/3, that would be great. But otherwise, I think it's just kind of not where Mardu wants to be. Then we've got Lumbering World Wagon and Thunderous Velocipede. Both of these are 3 mana green vehicles. The Lumbering World Wagon lets you search up basics, and then its power is equal to the number of lands you control. Greasefang already in Abzan doesn't really play that many basics. I think most people will play 2 max, and a lot of people will only play 1 unless we're in a meta where Field of Ruin or Demolition Field are heavily played. And so it's not a very good option to reanimate with Greasefang, even if it can be swinging in for 6 or 7 later in the game. Grabbing your only basic out of your deck and then it having no further effect is not particularly great. And then Thundering Velocipede is just 3 mana, 5/5 trample. Each other vehicle and creature enters with a 1/1 counter if its mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3. Would be a great option if we played a lot of higher value stuff. Notably, this can turn Parhelion into 18 damage because it gives the 2 angels an extra 1/1 counter each, and then Parhelion itself gets 3 1/1 counters. However, I think that's just a little overkill. It doesn't really help out your main strategy. It is fine as a beat stick. It's 5/5 trample with crew 3. I just don't think it's quite there. I would be definitely willing to brew something around this, but I don't think it quite fits in Greasefang in particular. Then we've got Dune Drifter, which is another kind of splashable option. So it's X white-black. When it enters, return target artifact or creature with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you might be thinking, wow, we can pay 5 mana to put this vehicle into play and reanimate Greasefang. And then maybe we think about that a little bit more and we're like, okay, we're paying 5 mana to reanimate Greasefang. And then on top of that, it's only a 3/3. And then if we reanimate it with Greasefang, it doesn't do anything for us. So we kind of see how this crumbles apart really quickly, and just isn't very useful to us, unfortunately. And then the last one is Guide Light Matrix. I think this card's a trap. I think much like Mech Hanger, this card is too slow. So, it does cantrip itself for 2 mana, and then you can pay 2 mana to turn a vehicle into a creature, but I think that that's just not good enough. I think we have, generally across all the archetypes, better ways to turn our vehicles into creature by just straight up crewing them with creatures that we're already going to be summoning sick as is, and I think that really cheaping out on turning a vehicle into a creature like this with Guide Light Matrix is really only powerful if you've got vehicles that are otherwise harder to turn into creatures. And we just don't really have that problem at the moment. So that's going to wrap it up for me. This is all of the cards that I picked out from Aetherdrift that I thought were worth mentioning for Greasefang. I hope that, don't take my opinion for fact. If you guys have your own evaluations of the card, feel free. I'm more than willing to be wrong, and it's very possible that we're all wrong, and maybe these cards aren't quite as good as we think they are. But only time will tell, and yeah, so keep driving the rat, keep hitting people with Parhelions, and y'all have a great day.